Okay, we are live. Welcome everybody. I can't believe that it is the last week. It seemed so daunting 8 or 10 weeks ago when we planned all this out, and now here we are, August 31st. We had a little bit of a schedule change for today, and that is because Maria, whom you've seen most weeks here, she actually was supposed to kind of be the leader today because she is a licensed mental health counselor. But it is also her kids, all three of her kids have their first day of virtual schooling today, and she has no electricity. So she's dealing with a lot and can't get online with us today. So we are going to adjust our topic a little bit and then do our wrap up, because today was supposed to be the wrap up, and we missed a week, of course, because of my father's passing. So we're combining two. But we still wanted to talk about mental health a little bit. What the group is going to get into today, with Maria being here as a professional who works in the field, we were going to talk about a few different things, but we wanted to get into some examples of how, like, racism, when you're experiencing it as a child, and these microaggressions or overt racism, and not having your needs met via your IEP, day in, day out. We're going to talk about what that has done to these kids. So I'm going to disappear for a while. I will be back when they are finished.
Good afternoon, everyone. We are grateful that you have counted it not robbery to join us again for this last installment of the intersection of race and disabilities. And as Lisa eloquently put it, we will be covering the topic of mental health among students of color with a disability or otherwise have an IEP in school. And so, throughout all of these broadcasts, some of the topics that have trended really have been around the disproportionality where students either have less access to resources based on race or based on their diagnosis or misdiagnosis. Also, where some of the impact of how those students are targeted and are their challenges or the results of their diagnosis oftentimes being attributed to misbehavior. And that too is on account of race. And where students are oftentimes, if they are Black or of color, treated as if they are much older than they truly are. And so there's an assumption or presumption of maturity, whereas that doesn't necessarily exist within other groups. So when it comes to the mental health, it seems to be something that is often left out of the conversation for these students. When there is a presence of generalization on the basis of behavior, as opposed to truly looking at a student and their potential as well as their abilities, and then how that corresponds with the disability that they might have. Oftentimes they're met with disciplinary action as opposed to receiving the supports that they need to effectively access their education. So briefly, I would love to turn to Cheryl Lynn, who can share an example of how her daughters experience, or perhaps not just her daughters, but even those that are in the same school might experience some of these responses to the results of their diagnosis, but instead it being attributed to behavioral issues and the impact that might have on the mental health of students. Cheryl Lynn?
Hi, thank you. I call it the invisible disability, because if they don't see a wheelchair or something, they think, oh, that kid is fine. They're just acting out. They forget to look at what's going on with the child. I actually had one teacher say to me that my child does not have ADHD. I had another school counselor say my child is schizophrenic and she has ADHD. She has behavior issues. Yes, but they never look at where is this behavior, like her anxiety gets the best of her if she feels she's being cornered or overwhelmed and they're not letting her explain herself. I have shared with the school her past trauma and how she's not comfortable around male teachers. Yet the school wanted her to meet one-on-one with a male person at the school without her therapist there or anyone there. And because she chose not to, which I said, why don't you understand? She doesn't feel comfortable. So they said that she was in a partnership with them. So that was a strike against her. She was not willing to work with the school, which was the other way around. The school was not willing to work with her disability and her issues surrounding men. This has gone on for years, and because she is Black, she is looked at like she should know better. She's older. Everything is, she brings it on herself, you know, whether she's wearing something or how her hair is. It's never looked at, where is this coming from? You know, it's always, why is she acting this way? Instead of saying, what happened to this child? Because the children don't choose to act out for no reason. There's a reason behind it. It might not be logical to us adults, but there's a reason behind it. And it's really hard when you have a child who's not only disabled, but considered a minority, because then they get it both ways. They get the fact that they're disabled, but then they're also targeted because of their color of their skin. And in the long run, that just adds more onto the child. And they're not able to, they wind up shutting down and don't trust anyone because where they've been placed and what has gone on within the school district. And she's treated totally different as opposed to my other one. Like I even said earlier to the panel, my other child, she's light-skinned. Her case manager came to the home today to help her get everything ready for the virtual schooling. So it's the same district, but treated totally different, only because of her color of her skin. And it's a sad thing, and she had to learn racism at a very young age. But that's the life, and I'll just have to teach her how to balance it and get through it and not look at it like it's anything she's done or anything that's wrong with her. No, it's what's wrong in people's minds, how they think because you're a different color, you're less than.
Yeah, and you know, one of the factors that really lends itself to this type of treatment or mistreatment or inappropriateness of a response to a child's behaviors and perhaps some of their reservations really is related to the disparate levels of access to quality mental health care, diagnosis. And some of those disparities are already visible among adults, where adults who are Black tend to have less access to quality care by virtue of either their location, their region, or economically, they're unable to access it because of affordability. Those same type of disparities transfer to students, to children of these same parents because of the same types of structures that limit that access. It's stated that student mental health care was already a growing concern before COVID-19. And there's always been a number of issues that lend toward building traumatic events for these students. Students who are in
So yeah, he's
a concentrated area where
really a master
other students look like them. So this school district is
and he's
black or brown. They have higher instances of witnessing
a couple weeks, but he's
violence
really strong.
or activity or violence in their neighborhood.
Super passionate about it.
So
that I think will be
depression, suicide, all of those are on the rise. But the rates at which they are rising are impacting students tragically younger and younger. Nationally, there's been a disinvestment from mental health programs. And in many ways, schools serve as a de facto mental health care facility for students. And so while these are on the rise and while disinvestment has taken place largely around the country from mental health programs, many remaining programs are more punitive than they are restorative. So it's about how we're responding to mental health care. Has that been something that even in your case, that has been prominent in the way that the school responds to your daughter, Cheryl Lynn?
Sorry. Yes, it has been difficult. Usually if you want to get some mental health for your child, a lot of them are waiting lists. If you even have the insurance they take. And I saw the school, their take on it was, she needs meds. And now we're just like, kids are being over medicated. Yes, there are some kids that do need it and benefit from it. But then there's some kids that meds are not a magic pill. There's not a magic pill. You have to have a combination of things, you know, between therapy, between meds, between the school environment, the home environment, all that plays into it. It's not just one thing. Here, take meds, you'll be fine. I mean, my youngest daughter took a lot of meds. She took a lot of meds from a young age. And after a while, I started seeing, I didn't want to go on that merry-go-round again with the meds. Take this one, and then you got to take another medication to combat the side effects of that one. And it's a vicious cycle. You'll be fine. You know, so I didn't want to go that route with this child. I let her take her ADHD medicine, and I let her take her mood stabilizing medication. But if she was still being put back in the school system that was on her constantly, I was not going to go and continue increasing the doses when you at school are not doing anything. I'm doing my part as a parent. But where's your part? I mean, she's with you for 6 hours a day. And it's really sad because there's a lot of kids, especially like young, I would say like from 11 to 14, there's an increase in kids' suicide between the school bullying. All this stuff plays into, even a kid that doesn't have mental issues to begin with, when they get abused so much, they will have mental issues. It's just as a fact. That's just what happens. You know, some kids are born with it. Some kids might inherit it. Some kids it's brought upon them from adults. And that's where I find it so hard, because you change what and who this child was supposed to be by doing what you do, whether it's verbally or physically or emotionally abusing them. You change the makeup of this child, and that's forever change.
Yeah, you know, data from 2017, as reported by the Center for Law and Social Policy, and also underscored by the CDC, it shows that when we're talking about traumas that impact children, first of all, we have to consider the adverse childhood experiences that they have. And there's determinants of health, social determinants that we'll go over in a bit. But when we're talking about the adverse childhood experiences, there's an important aspect of that where if it's something that is measured for every child, and then we respond to such a measurement with appropriate solutions, services, and supports, we could really curb the rates at which students are impacted by trauma, or at least give them access to quality support so that they can effectively overcome them and still be successful as a student with outcomes, positive outcomes. But one of the factors that plays into this is really poverty. Now, when we look at poverty around the country, it says in the US as of 2019, 16.2% of children live in poverty. And poverty, of course, is one of the social determinants of mental health. And at 16.2% of all children, of that, the rate is actually nearly 2 times higher for Black children. So you already have a disproportionality of living or experiencing poverty, and then having to contend with that while maintaining a certain degree of strength or fortitude to be able to get over it without effective supports. For Black children, it's 29.5% of Black children in this country that live in poverty. And so if 1 in 3 live in poverty and we already have limited resources and supports in schools, the outcome is all but sure that these students will struggle to get over these adverse childhood experiences that they have had. Monique, I'd love to turn to you in hopes that you can add some context here about how these play into a child's mental health and really how it impacts their performance and outcomes in school.
I think that a lot of times it's misunderstood, especially with our Black children, that it's sometimes looked at behaviorally. And the outcomes are usually where the disproportionality occurs within discipline areas, the way that they are disciplined. Sometimes mental health issues can be looked at as disruptive behavior, or those challenges where the thoughts that perhaps there may be some mental health issues. It's really interesting. It's never called mental health or challenging. It's just behaviors. You have bad behavior. So some of the supports and services that might be available and provided are not. Or just as Cheryl Lynn was saying earlier, sometimes adverse childhood experiences are looked at, again, not hearing or looking at who that family is. And we've talked about that so many times before, about knowing who you are speaking to across that child study team table, or who this family is. A lot of the times, children, especially young Black boys, may be given diagnosis of ADHD or some type of obstinate behavior classification, versus this may be some adverse childhood experiences that should not be classified inappropriately in the way that it is. And so I know that Cheryl Lynn had spoken a little bit about that earlier. But again, when we look at being Black and autistic, and it always puzzles me, especially for young men with autism. And a lot of times when puberty begins, how all of a sudden you have mental health challenges. Is it really mental health challenges, or is this all still part of the spectrum? But it's then looked at in a way where, and I'm going to explain some of my own son's experiences of when those things kicked in. And this was the only time after some really intense hospitalizations that he finally got a diagnosis, changed from multiply disabled to autism through 3 commitments. And I'm not saying admittance, because I had no idea what commitment meant until it happened. And the fact that when a person with autism has these mental health issues, or if it was a mental health area, we would say psychiatric issues or meltdowns. I remember spending hours, one time 48 hours in the emergency room when he was under 18, because what would they say? This isn't psychiatric. He's a person with autism. So we would never put them in a psychiatric hospital or on a psychiatric ward, but they had no place. And then here in New Jersey, when something did come available, it looked very different to me, the people that were there, and still some other people that weren't Black, whose young people went other places where the treatment was a little bit different. So I think that there's always that thing of being very diligent as a parent to ensure, even around these commitments, because, these are areas now where you're having a dual diagnosis and you're trying to navigate both of these systems, and a system that really doesn't want to address the dual diagnosis. You always still end up with the developmental disabilities, and trying to ensure, and this can even go back to what we were talking about with transition, capturing all of these pieces. Because remember what we said, what does life look like after 21? So if these things kick in during puberty, now what does that do? What other types of services and supports do you need to ensure are in your sons and daughters' lives? So to me, I mean, anyone else can speak to it. I still find that conversation around autism, and that's what all of these conversations were really about, how we do navigate successfully that dual diagnosis or those areas, and how supports and services, which are scarce for all, how they are even disproportionately less available for a community that's even just beginning to discuss going to therapy, right? So that also falls into those type of things. Saphir, I hope I answered. I did the best I could.
No, yeah, you definitely did, and I appreciate that. I want to draw everyone's attention really briefly to some of the recommendations that could be made when it comes to emotional disturbance. We talked briefly in prior broadcasts about emotional behavioral disturbance classifications, and how in many cases these are given to children, particularly Black and brown children, who are just deemed socially maladjusted.
Yeah.
They are a category that, if nothing else fits, it's used as a catch-all for everyone else. And as unfortunate as that may seem, there are certain responses that can help to curb some of these disparate rates that we are seeing when it comes to the adverse childhood experiences, as well as mental health challenges. And so, as shown here, one of the recommendations is really around having a trauma-informed framework of care. And this is something I would recommend in any school district, but especially those where there's a larger concentration of minority students. The National Child Traumatic Stress Network System Framework is one such example. And really it offers 10 core areas of a trauma-informed school. But look at what they include: cultural responsiveness, emergency management and crisis response, staff self-care and secondary traumatic stress, prevention and intervention related to traumatic stress, And really it's involves a system-wide approach to ensure that every person who is engaging that child throughout the day is aware of some of these determinants or causes of trauma and traumatic stress, as well as identification and partnering with each other to respond appropriately. But also there's a cross-system collaboration needed where it's really broadening the community for that student and not leaving the school in isolation as the only response to trauma, but really partnering with other organizations in that school district to ensure that there's a continuum of care after school.
You know, Safir, and again, when we think about all of this and what it, you know, we talk a lot about the school to prison pipeline, and if you look at statistics as well, you know, we talk about the number of Black and Brown people that may be incarcerated due to disabilities. A lot of those numbers double, or you may find that same in regards to emotional issues or in jail or incarcerated due to some type of mental health challenges, where again, you're not receiving the type of supports and services that you need to have you live a fulfilling life.
Absolutely. You know, there's also certain power structures that exacerbate the problems that we're seeing when it comes to the mental health challenges or adverse childhood experiences that Black and Brown children are faced with. And they include things like racism. They include things like classism, but there's also specific challenges that help to exacerbate that, such as, because the fact that ACEs are more common among children living in poverty, we have to begin to acknowledge that the racial wealth gap is a huge factor when it comes to how the adverse experiences are played out in the life and in the mind of a Black child versus others. You know, there's a high prevalence of ACEs among Black children as a result of that. While Black families in general are only about 10% of wealth of white families, there's generally no correlation made when it comes to how such a huge and drastic and just devastating figure would play into a child's adverse childhood experiences and how they bring that into the classroom. So that really means that addressing this and really ensuring that there's any type of permanence in how we address some of these inequalities, it really means that we have to address the racial wealth gap. We also have to address the inequities that exist when it comes to access to care and access to quality healthcare and mental health care.
Yes, Safir, I can agree with you. As we're sitting here talking, I'm thinking about the story you told us a few sessions back about your son, who they said his knife and fork were weapons or something like that. And, you know, I think about what we as Brown and Black people deal with often on a daily basis of racism. Think about the trauma of racism.
Mm-hmm.
That combines with some of the disabilities we're dealing with, some of the other issues. I sent you a link on the social determinants of health, and I just wanted, if you could pull that up, there's like a graphic on there, Safir, because I just want to talk about that a little bit. Recently graduating from nursing school, I was really kind of upset going through nursing school when they would say, oh, well, you know, there's this rash and it looks like this, or someone turns red, or someone goes pale. And I'm sitting there thinking, So what does that look like in me? What does that look like for someone? Like, why aren't we talking about how it looks in someone who's different? Because it's always centered around, you know, a white person and not everyone. We have different skin tones and colors, right? And when I think about mental health and I think about disability and I think about trauma, I mean, let's all face it. As brown people, we often, when you're dealing with racism, microaggressions, that ultimately, day in and day out, leads to trauma, PTSD. Things happen, you get triggered, you get upset, you're sad, you know, another person was shot in the back. How do you know, and this seems to be just this regular occurrence, and it's painful. I'm having a hard time with all of this, and where I'm going, and I know you're probably looking for the graph that I'm talking about severe. If you just scroll down a little bit, you'll see it. One of the things I wanted to talk about, and Sophia brought it up a little bit earlier, was the social determinants of health. And that was something that I actually learned about in nursing school. But it's really, it's something that if we can work on the disparities with respect to the social determinants of health, then there's a lot that is going to be, how can I put it, remedied here. Or just, I mean, and Sophia, other people have brought it up. So let's talk about what the 5 social determinants of health are. One of them is economic stability. Let's talk about that. We know Black and brown people, they don't make as much. And it's not because they're not capable. We all know that. There are issues with employment. There's food insecurity, food deserts. They can't get healthy food. Housing instability, poverty. Sophia mentioned poverty earlier. Then we have the other, the second one, which is education. What's happening in early childhood education and development? What does the enrollment look like for college? High school graduation rates, language and literacy, you know, people who don't, who maybe don't speak English, or maybe can't even read. You know, they're just pushed through the system and they graduate from high school and they can't even read. And then let's look at the social and community context. That's the third determinant of health. And in that we're looking at things like discrimination, incarceration. Monique brought that up. And I guess, you know, being together, and we're looking at community, okay? Community involvement. The fourth social determinant of health is basically healthcare, health and healthcare, access to healthcare. Do you have health insurance? Can you afford to pay for health insurance? Okay. Health literacy. Do you even understand? I mean, look at, I guess, just this past weekend with Chadwick Boseman passing away from colon cancer. I looked at the rates of colon cancer in Black people, and it's like, wait a minute, what? Why? Why? Because of some of the other things I talked about, right? The quality of the water, the environment, the food. They all contribute to that. Maybe it's education. And then we have our neighborhoods. And, you know, again, I'm talking about there's issues with crime and violence. I mentioned housing, environmental concerns, access to food. I remember in nursing school, one of the students, they had done their project on this thing about like not having access to food. And so I just asked a question. I said, well, what do you think they should do? And they were like, oh, well, they could take an Uber, or maybe they could like get one of those, you know, food delivery services. And I'm just shaking my head because I'm like, you know, you don't get it. Because if they can't even afford food, do you really think they can afford an Uber? You think they can pay extra to have that food delivered? So when you look at all of these determinants of health and we consider how they affect a person, I mean, because basically all of them, I mean, I'm just gonna like kind of summarize them again. Your neighborhood and your environment, health and healthcare, your social community or your surroundings, education and economic stability, all of those. So think about those and think about where Black and brown people fit into those. And in every single category, they are below, well below on average. So I think that if we just take a step back and stop saying, oh, you know, it's because they just want to get welfare, or, you know, I mean, just all of these like stereotypes and things like that. Honestly, we're all human. And it feels like as I watch what's happening in our world today, that we're often treated as subhuman. I see people get more upset with how a dog is treated or a pet than how a Black person is treated when they're murdered or injured or something happens. And, you know, it's a thing where I guess, you know, what I want to say in closing is that first off, listen, and that's what we are here to do, is to talk. But second off, challenge those people who are saying things like, oh, well, they deserved it, or they had a weapon, or they, you know, I mean, take a step back, really, and come to terms with yourself, and then speak out. Because, you know, when I think about this, and it is upsetting to me, I have 3 Black sons, and I remember saying to my one son, like, oh, you know, I feel bad because I know there's, you know, racism, and I'm concerned about what people say or do. And you know what he said to me? He's like, Mom, you know what? That's their problem. I never let it bother me because I know what I'm doing, and I know I'm intelligent, and you know what? They're the ignorant ones, and it's their problem. And you know what? He's right. And I'm glad that he's not bothered by it. But I can't help but think as a parent that with the trauma of him, even in, you know, what, he was like 3 or 4 and the kids chased him and stole his shoes and called him names, you know, like, I'm sure that I mean, that affects you, you know, period. I don't care what anybody says. And you need to be able to like talk about it and get beyond it. But I guess the main thing I just want to leave you with is, please believe what's being said. Look at the numbers. Speak up, because as brown people, we can't, we're doing what we can do. And it's not really a brown problem. Sophia?
Yeah, thank you so much for that, Thea. You're absolutely right. When we start to look at how the media, society around us continues to normalize, and whether it's intentional or not, it gets normalized for us to see violence against Black people at the hands of law enforcement, or as you stated, the response to that violence or the response to the protesting that suggests that the value of the life that was lost and or changed forever is less than that of a dog, man's best friend, as you just mentioned. In the chart that we're sharing, you were talking about some of those social determinants. This chart here shows us children living with at least one parent employed year-round, full-time. And consistently from 2010 all the way through the latest data available in 2017, African Americans are at the bottom of the list, whereas just above, also close to the very bottom, are Hispanic and Latinos, and a separate segment for Mexican Americans. These numbers here are really shameful to see, but it certainly highlights the same point that you brought up, that and this is not even wealth we're talking about, we're just talking about access to income, access to quality health insurance, thereby giving you access to better health care. In my experience, there are doctors who are highly sought after who will not accept Medicaid. And they have every right to choose to do that. But because we've privatized that type of system, and it's not a public good, it then allows them to systematically omit largely Black Americans who will be impacted by such a scenario from their client base or their patient base. And therefore, it's a standard that continues to lend itself to exasperating these problems. So as we prepare to move into our next segment of the discussion, I think in many ways, we could talk about this all day, but we'd really be highlighting similar points that point to more devastating outcomes. I think it's also important that we take the opportunity to begin to calibrate all of the findings that we have provided throughout the course of this series, and begin to use that opportunity to provide insights about how we move forward from here. I believe Lisa has prepared something to begin that discussion. And then as we jump into that, we'll entertain questions as well from the broadcast online in Facebook. I hope, Lisa, that you can hear me and that you are prepared. Thank you so much.
Yep, and I'm unmuted. Okay. Thank you, Saphir, and everyone else who spoke today. It feels different today, and I don't know if that's the weather, or we're all overwhelmed, or the first day of school, or world events, or all of the above. Probably the case, because I know that it seems like the hits keep on coming, and of course, with Chadwick passing away over the weekend, and then learning the news that because he's Black, he had to hide his disability. And, that's a decision he made for him and his family. But he knew at the end of it all that he would not have been given the job opportunities that he had those folks known that he had an illness or a disability of some kind. So that, I don't know, I'll just stop there because I don't know what it's like to be a Black man. As I said earlier in June, I did a quick Facebook Live with my friend Kyle Boyer, who at the time was running for state Senate. Unfortunately, he did not win his primary, but one thing that he had said to me was that it was time to listen, and for white people to listen to Black people and to put in the work. And I didn't really know what that meant. So I decided to sit on that for a few days and listen. And I thought, well, okay, let's listen, and I want to hear. And I put it in the Facebook group. And that's how this panel came to be, with the addition of a few people said, oh, you also need to reach out to this person and, email this person, let's get them in the loop. And even though everyone couldn't be here today, unfortunately, I want to say thank you publicly to the group for donating your time the past several weeks or the whole summer. And I know that this,
And Joe, it probably wouldn't be a bad idea for Juan.
Has not been easy on you guys. I know that, reliving trauma is not easy. And I hope that those folks who are watching with the intent of listening and learning, I hope that you understand that we've asked these people and they've agreed to relive and recite a trauma that they've already been through. And that's not easy to do. So as part of the listening and learning, of course, I've learned a lot about, first, let me go back. I've been Kyle also suggested that I watch the movie 13th, so I did. And then my husband's work, actually, they did kind of like a book club, movie club kind of thing, and they asked them to watch 13th. So we watched it again, so that he could discuss it at work. And that I've done that. I've read some books. I've been reading, like Allie Henney and Austin Channing Brown and other places. And of course, all of those things combined have had some influence on me. I don't know that as far as what I've learned, I can't necessarily piece out specifically what I've heard from you folks, since I've been reading and watching other things, and all the how to be anti-racist stuff and his readings and teachings. So I've been trying. As I tell you my thoughts as wrap up, I'm well aware of white privilege and white fragility and white people centering themselves and making the issue about them. So I'm trying really hard not to do that. But at the end of the day, one of the goals of this listening sessions was for white people to listen and learn. So that's, I'm going to be sharing that. But as in my day-to-day conversations, I'm really trying to slow down and be more intentional. I tend to be very impulsive anyway. I just do things. I'm a task-oriented person. I just like to get things done, and I don't always think them through. So now knowing and learning and seeing all these biases that I didn't know I had, I'm really trying to slow down and say, wait a minute, before you react, before you email that person back, before you respond, before you call them back, and really thinking it through. So as far as the panel, I think what I learned the most is the term microaggression is just new to me this summer. I hadn't even ever heard that term before. My definition of racism has completely changed. It is completely so much bigger than it was before. I had always thought of it as just really kind of overt, nasty, name calling and spray painting businesses and, just overt stuff. I wasn't aware of that it's this constant barrage of microaggressions, all day, every day. And I don't even know what to say about that. It really hits home for me. Cases like Breonna Taylor, because I think home should be your safe place. Home should be the one place in the entire planet where you don't have to experience racism. And she didn't even have that. I'm not saying that anybody who goes out on the street deserves to get what any of those folks have gotten. That's not what I'm saying. But I feel like you can't even feel safe and comfortable in your own home. And because there was, of course, the other young man in Texas who the police officer said she was at the wrong apartment or whatever, and she went in and killed him. So you can't even escape it in your own apartment. And that, I don't know, that was just a learning for me. Like I said, it's just so all day, every day. The little things, like when Monique talked about going to try to get her son an apartment, and Saphir's son's experiences. And when Maria talked about her daughter, they tried to steer her away from the standardized test that would allow her to graduate when she's only 8 years old, and already they're steering her down an academic path that isn't to high school graduation. That's definitely going to change how I approach IEP meetings. I know with my clients, I'm and hopefully with some of your help and input, I want to compile a checklist for myself, so for when we finish IEP meetings and when I'm reviewing an IEP with a client. I think a lot of it has to do with not just knowing biases, but we get so brainwashed in IEPs that the I is an IEP and they're individuals. And, maybe I'm not going to divulge client information from client to client, but sometimes I think IEPs and clients do need to be compared to each other. And I've just been in my training, we've just been kind of brainwashed to not do that. It's the I in IEP, the person's an individual and what's right for them isn't necessarily right for the other. But, there are a lot of similarities between our kids. So I think that I will start looking at, same district kids, what's this child getting versus what this child's getting and so on. And certainly with evaluations, I really enjoyed that segment. That is, I hope to be able to better serve my clients that way. As far as getting them fair evaluations. Let's see. What else? I'm back. My blog's been around now for almost 10 years. And I used to do this thing called the Tuesday to-do list. And I would give the readers an action item for lobbying or advocacy every Tuesday. And it was like, call them about this bill, call your whatever about this bill. I stopped doing that because I could see behind the scenes who was following through and clicking the links, and not many people were. So I stopped doing that. But I'm thinking of bringing that back in some capacity as I see, maybe not weekly, but as I see things online that others are asking for. To do. I've learned that racism really has nothing to do with the fact that it has nothing to do with numbers. And I don't think being a minority, I don't think that has anything really to do with it. I think it's about skin color, not how many Black people there are. And the reason I say that is trying to apply what I'm learning to, say, the city of Philadelphia, which is predominantly Black, but it's also the poorest big city in America, and my own town where I am the minority, but I'm not treated like the minority. And that's something, there's a group of a couple dozen of us who have been working on some local government issues to kind of flip that around. And I'm anxious for next year to happen so that we can hopefully make more progress on that, because we had some really significant, some significant issues with our local government, and calling one of our Latino activists and threatening to get him fired from his job and stuff like that. So I'm anxious to get to kind of, my town is just so segregated, and I'm anxious for that to change, I guess, because it's just definitely an old boys network. I definitely plan to make this a regular feature. I was a little disappointed in a lot of my fellow white people as I posted things throughout the summer. I'm really pretty amazed at, like, I get on Twitter when people, like, if you're kind of anonymous on Twitter or on other platforms where you don't have to say your name, but these people on Facebook who are just like saying all this stuff, you know what I mean? And I'm like, I don't know. There's a lot more there. I don't know if it is our president's fault that people are more comfortable saying it now, or if it's, I don't know. I did not know that there was that much of it out there. So many white people just willing to say, well, that's wrong or something, you know, like just the responses when I would post something, an article or an interesting article. And like I said, I was disappointed in that, but it shows that there's a need that hopefully more people will try to also listen and learn. I do a lot of lobbying and activism for the rare disease community because my son has a rare disease. And it kind of occurred to me that there really aren't very many Black families or Black parents involved in that community. The conferences I go to, the workshops, lobbying sessions, things like that. So that's something when I partner with them, you know, I'm going to start asking them, like, well, how come, you know, Black people get rare diseases too. So how come there aren't any people here, you know, because there just usually aren't.
That chuckle slipped out. It's not that I'm laughing at what you're saying. It's that all of the issues that you've mentioned are concerns of people of color, of Black folks, of Latina, you know, rare disease. My son has a rare condition. I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
My son has a rare condition, and it's not that I'm not interested in the groups that are related to his particular diagnoses. It's that there's so much that I have to carry that something had to take a priority. So there are times when, and this is what I think some folks, and I don't by no means speak for anybody other than myself and me and mine, but when people are uncomfortable, it's usually because they're either fearful of something or they're uneducated about something. So it shouldn't be that because a person of color, because a Black person isn't in a group, that their issues shouldn't be addressed, because those issues relate to everyone who has whatever the condition is. So and I thought about the phrase that mentioned when we were summing up the last meeting, when you're accustomed to privilege, equality feels like oppression. That's why there are some folks who are so bent out of shape when people of color, when Black folks, when Latina folks are requesting equality. They're not even asking for anything extra. They're just asking for what is afforded to everyone else. So leading it back to your point about, why aren't there any people of color in a rare disease? And it's not that, first off, it's rare diseases. So maybe there is a prevalence, just like, sickle cell affects people of color more frequently than it does white folks, or people of Mediterranean descent, to be more specific. But in the grand scheme of things, if I could wave my magic wand and make everything wonderful, it really shouldn't matter, because the issues that are addressed affect everyone. The reason why it does matter is because the country that we're in, these United States of America, have always been based on racist issues. It was founded on racist issues. So as we're talking about mental health earlier, I joke, but I'm serious. I got this from a comedian. Black folks didn't invent the blues for nothing. There's a reason why people of color, may have different issues that aren't addressed, and also they may not be all of that interested in expressing what those concerns are, knowing full well what the blowback is going to be. Right? Then add to that, because Saphir mentioned, and a number of you mentioned, the adverse childhood experiences. I actually pulled up an article that spoke to how even within that study, there were disparities among how the experiences were codified, were taken down. I mean, the information was recorded, how the information was recorded. So it's cyclical in how these things come up. Those in a generation before us, and I don't know how old all of you are, but when people talk about the civil rights in the 60s, well, this is another iteration of those sort of civil rights issues. And hopefully we've taken it a step further, because when you look at the protests that are happening, you see a broader range of people being involved. You hear about making accommodations for people with disabilities. Hopefully it'll take another iteration. But when it comes to how we're providing services and how we're providing the things that our young adults, our children with disabilities need, we have to be the ones to make that fight. It's tiresome if no one else is in that movement with us. It's very, very, very tiresome. So some of the next steps I would ask anyone who's participated and hung out with us in all of these Monday afternoon sessions is to be a little bit self-reflective about how you make decisions. It shouldn't always be the person of color speaking up for other people of color. I give you points, Lisa, for allowing this platform on your website, right? But I shouldn't always have to be the one. I should not always have to be the one. There should be someone who has checked their own implicit biases and say, yeah, you know what? Look around the room. Why aren't there any Black people here? Why aren't there any Latina people here? I shouldn't always have to be the one to say that.
You're right. And I'm as far as the rare disease thing, that might have been not the right example. But what I'm thinking of, like in rare diseases right now, what our focus is, how are we going to connect patients to clinical trials for some of these rare diseases? And I think if there's no Black parents in that room listening, how are they going to know about the clinical trials? So I'm not saying that I have all the answers, and I know.
No, and I don't, and I don't want you to feel like I was picking on you for that
Yeah.
example. You brought it up, but then let's speak to, put that in historical context. There's a reason why plenty of Black folks don't sign up for clinical trials.
Right.
Yeah, I was coming for that point.
There's a reason.
Right.
I just want to, I think that, if we really want to think and we're asking everybody, what are they taking from this? Or what is, I think it's really interesting through the weeks, as we've been doing this the last couple of weeks. I'm always watching, even with the media, are we now getting to the point where all of this isn't cool again? Because every week the numbers go down on the people that are listening. You hear certain things on social media, but there's other things that you don't. But interesting here, everyone wanted to listen. Everybody's throwing out books. What should I read? What should I do? And it's getting very quiet. And, one of the things that we asked was to listen. And then what can you do after that? It's listening in order to create understanding and awareness. And I think that's part of what Lisa is saying with her checklist. But I think that Lisa said something even more profound a couple of weeks ago. And I think it's something that everybody can do. And even with what you're talking about with your the rare disease platform that you have, it's now about listening and now opening your mouth. It's about saying just what you just said here, Lisa. Why is there not any people of color or Black families involved? You spoke about what, and it's about no longer, you've listened, now open your eyes. Because you know what your districts look like, you know what equity can look like across the board, and you know when you don't see it. So Lisa was talking about the individual educational plan. Yes, it is about an individual, but we all know what everybody needs and how they need to be supported. And we may see someone getting supported better and we choose not to speak about it. So I think that is something that everyone that's listening wants to be an ally, that wants to be a better ally, or just wants to be a better person. Speak up.
And like, was it Sharon last week that said she didn't even want allies, she wanted co-conspirators?
And even that, I always wonder, we always speak words, where they come from. I think those are always words of comfort that don't come from our community. Again, it's finding these words or acronyms to be comfortable in what you're not comfortable with. And it's really, again, just about listening, about speaking up, about trying to make changes where you can, about speaking up, but also about using the platforms that you have to address the inequities that you see.
And a couple other things. My husband and I have been talking about this, and of course we have people who in our circle of life who are like us and trying to be better people, and we have people who are racist and not interested in changing. And we are reevaluating those relationships and how we're going to handle them going forward. Now, right now, the pandemic has kind of given us a pass on seeing these people. But I'm okay with having, I live in what's considered, my zip code is actually considered rural, even though it's suburban Philadelphia. And, a lot of white people have guns out here. So I have had those conversations with parents for play dates saying, and it's awkward to go to someone's house and drop your kid off. And hey, before I drop them off, do you have any guns in the house and are they locked up? I've done that. I've overcome that. So I can overcome. And I know now that it's not enough to say, because this is what I used to say is, please don't say that in front of my children when I would hear something racist. And that was uncomfortable for me, but I can take it one step further because we have to. It's not enough to just say, please don't say that in front of my children. And we haven't decided what that's going to be yet. Like, please change, or we're not going to see you ever again. I don't know. I don't know how exactly how that's going to play out, but it is, it is this watershed moment, and I don't know why it's happening this year when it should have happened 10 or 20 or 50 years ago, but
And
it is.
Lisa, to your point, there's always been a lot of focus, at least in recent years, on diversity itself. When in reality, to really address inequities, diversity is secondary. It's a factor. But what we have to really do is really reverence cultural differences, reverence the humanity and experiences of children and their families in the community. The curriculum in schools, the materials that they receive, they should reverence all those cultures that exist. They should be inclusive so that every student can see themselves in the curriculum. And really, rather than the dominant narrative taught in major segments of the nation, we really have to remove what is detrimental to marginalized student groups and include what is beneficial for everyone. And that really is giving them something that reveres their culture, reveres what the differences are, celebrates them, and doesn't just acknowledge it. We have to move from acknowledgement to celebration. And really, that's a shift, and that certainly will take a significant undertaking, but it's not impossible. And really, in 2020, it should be the norm in education and in special education.
You're right. And that's something that's very visible in my community because it's such a large Latino population, and certain things like the quinceañera and other celebrations are very visible celebrations, and they're very, you can see them and you can hear them, but that, to me, when I see one and I think, oh, that looks like so much fun, but it highlights to me the complete segregation within my own town, that they almost have to celebrate in private, whereas it's not celebrated like a birthday, like an American white birthday. And it should be, like you said, it should be celebrated. This is so important to them in their culture. And we don't revere that to the point where it's just not even acknowledged, I guess. So I'm anxious to hopefully our town making strides. I think the hurricane 2 weeks ago really, it was really a catalyst in that it flooded out a lot of our Latino residents. It displaced, I think, 28 families. And the the official town response to that was poor at best. So that really highlighted and it motivated people and for change, because it really was their lives at stake, their livelihoods are at stake, and we'd have 100 people without homes because of the flooding.
And Lisa, that highlights, I know we've been talking about the intersection of race and disabilities because, that's the series topic. But your point highlights racism and classism at every level of our society. Because if folks are washed out of their home and you see a difference because of the color of their skin, that speaks to decisions made at a level higher than the folks in the neighborhood. Hopefully neighbors that weren't flooded out helped out if they could. But if there's a large, system that comes through and wipes everybody out, and it requires a governmental response, and that response is poor, that speaks to systemic racism. That speaks to structural racism. And, as we've talked about the social determinants of health and the employment rates, those things are unfortunately often race-based. And Saphir specifically mentioned poverty. Well, then there's the level of folks that are too poor to be rich and too rich to be poor, and might be 2 paychecks away from poverty. So
Mhm.
their stress is at a higher level to make sure that they keep the full-time job and maybe even the part-time job. So that's another reason why they may not be able to attend, the after-school meeting, or the third IEP meeting, or the group session around, whatever the challenge is for their child. So there are, and I'm not saying this to complain, and I'm not saying this by way of just, woe is me. These are just the facts of the extra level of challenge that comes with racism. The other piece is that, we talked about the oppressor and the oppressed. Well, the folks who were doing the oppressing have to twist themselves into pretzels to justify the things that they do to oppress people. I mean, if you take it all the way back to, we're not that far away from slavery. There are still, grandchildren. And I think there was a gentleman who was in his 90s who was a child of a slave. But if you take it all the way back, think of how many things you have to justify to mistreat another person and have them do something for you without properly compensating them. It's got to be a pretty twisted mindset. And so, I am a United States citizen, and to the extent that it'll accept my love, I love this country, but it has issues from its very inception that we have yet as a country to deal with. And then folks who have family members and loved ones with disabilities also deal with some of those same things. And I would venture to say, and this is only my opinion, that there are some people who are not people of color, who are not Black folks, who have children with disabilities, then realize how their children are not treated well, and they don't get, what Black folks have been dealing with and people of color have been dealing with all along. So not that I justify mistreating folks, but I can often say, hey, welcome to my world. Welcome to our world, when your child doesn't get what it is you feel like they deserve. So you
Right.
get a little taste. And I've had to remind many a person that the services and the laws, the IDEA, are based on civil rights laws out of the separate but unequal Brown versus Board of Education. The disability laws were based on those laws. So if anyone should understand the history of being mistreated because of your race and because of your ethnicity, it should be families of kids who have disabilities, because those services are based on those laws. And I've had people argue me with that. I'm like, you know what? I'm not going to argue with you on it. I protect my energy in that regard. You go look it up and come back and tell me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, I'm sad to leave you guys today, and I hope that we, stay in touch. I know that also locally, it just made front page news because Kennett Township, which is one of the townships near me, they publicly, at a public meeting, their township supervisor said that, we are embracing the Black Lives Matter movement, and we are going to reevaluate every policy that we have, policing, everything, and that they're making a commitment to doing this. So I saw a definition of hope the other day from a Black activist, and I can't find it. I couldn't find it this morning to share. But it was just about having a different, because even having hope is a white privilege. And so he had kind of flipped it around and said what hope truly meant to him. I wish I could find it, but so I tentatively say that I have hope that things are going to get better. I don't know, last week and weekend activities don't necessarily inspire that in me. But it's not about me. I hope that we can all, what are you going to say? Hate is too great a burden to bear. We have to focus on love, and I hope that, love will prevail. And I think it will. I know that you guys have touched a lot of people. Let me see if I can find it. I asked in the group if anybody had some thoughts to share, and I got a couple. And one mom said, "Thank you to the parents who through this moment helped me see that because of my own white supremacy, I was engaging in white saviorism and white superiority thinking." And just a lot along those lines. So, I think it's a slow way to go to try to reach people one by one, but I think that that's happening, and I think that a movement will be created. So I don't know if anybody else has anything they want to add as final thoughts as we wrap up. I wasn't that eloquent, even though I seriously have 3 pages of notes. So,
there was some commentary offered by Ta-Nehisi Coates. He was interviewed by Stephen Colbert. And I don't know if this is related to what you were referring to, but it sounds like it. He was talking about how white supremacy is so pervasive in society and how it infiltrates education and the justice system and every system really where services are provided to the public. And he was asked by Stephen Colbert, well, isn't there hope? And to that, the answer he gave was that level of optimism might really be another privilege of the oblivious.
I think that's,
yeah,
I think that was it.
And when we think about that, really there is a certain level of comfort in obliviousness. There is certainly a level of detachment. And I think that's really why we encounter those who either want to be savior or otherwise look at you and assume that you just don't know how to access the services because they're so readily available to their families and their children. It's important to understand that those differences are a result of structural racism. And I think it's really going to take consistent conversation about this. I'm glad that we spread this out over all of these weeks. I hope that the reach has been broad enough that those who are either on the fence or perhaps unaware of their own biases, of their own privilege, can really begin to piece together how the successes they've employed or enjoyed were completely unavailable to entire groups of people in the same country. And I'm just hopeful, not to that level of optimism. Everyone has hope about their individual potential for success, but collectively, after seeing so many years of doors slammed in the face of protesting or nonviolent response and organization to address some of these inequities, injustice still rears its ugly head. And so that level of hope is largely unavailable because of the impediments that continue to just infiltrate every area of our society. And how even now today, as you mentioned, in response to the license given to overt racism, where now people are more public about their feelings toward Black people, their disdain for immigration, immigrants, and never even acknowledging the fact that the entire country is largely populated with immigrants. I mean, that's how we were formed. So, you know, it certainly can be conquered, but it is definitely going to take some wide swinging bravery to really take a bold approach to address policies and practices that enable it to continue.
And well, and I think thanks to you guys, I am better informed to do that and to, and to help engage, you know, I talk with my school board members all the time, but now I know, you know, we're going to have some talks about, you know, curriculum. And I keep thinking of this quote that said, you know, don't be mad that Michelle Obama told you that the White House was built by slaves. Be mad that your history teacher didn't.
That's right.
You know, and that's just it. That's where we need to focus, I think, or where I'm going to focus my time and energy is not on, if you're going to get mad at her for saying it, that's on you, but I'm going to focus on my volunteering for the curriculum committee, and let's reevaluate all these courses that we're teaching and what are we teaching, you know, start to finish. What books, what literature? I have a friend who's a Black librarian, and she's going to come on and talk about characters in literature, because that's a focus for her. And, you know, the little subtleties and racism and biases that I'm sure I don't see when I read books, or that a lot of teachers don't see when they assign these books. So anyway, Jess, you want to talk? Want me to unmute you?
I'm missing Black boy.
What?
You're muted.
Oh,
Jess.
I'm sorry.
Oh, there you
Yeah,
go.
I wasn't. I don't know if I got a little delayed there. Yeah, I really just wanted to start by just saying, you know, having listened to all of you, one of the things that's going to make a huge difference is being, I guess, honest with the realities and taking a perspective of not being so skeptical of the realities of statistics, because I think that's where a lot of people oddly get twisted up in this conversation of race, is sort of being very okay with the idea that police brutality exists, but somehow the statistics and the inequities that do exist must pertain in almost isolation, and therefore commenting on it is now almost unreasonable for them to be doing. And I get frustrated because those are just symbolic. These very obvious statistics are symbolic of the systemic racism that exists within our nation as a whole. And we can look at statistics like the ones that Thea had produced for us about health and the social determinants of health, that they include healthcare, your neighborhood, your economy, your education, your social and community centers, that all of those demonstrate statistics that specifically talk about how race and gaps in, or race, and eventually how you could, or how it determines one's health, are related. But the moment we start talking, we have a conversation about IEPs being affected by race, it's suddenly an odd thing, or it's something you're going to feel challenged by. I think it's a really intentionally ignorant comment to make. Well, you know, maybe it was because of the way they said something or did something. And I think you have to just accept the very real statistics that exist, and then be willing to accept the consequences of everything. And so one of the things I really wanted to mention is that if you continue with this like very Western sentiment of rugged individualism, if you continue with this very Western sentiment of basically what's essentially social Darwinism, you're not just racist, you're not just ableist, but you're complicit and aiding and abetting in all of these problems. And it's very frustrating because as I hear all of this, it's like the number one thing everyone is probably or the reason that they joined this series is because they already agreed that something needed to be done, not be able to do things if it's tried harder or more, is in direct conflict with what they already know, which is it doesn't matter if everything's tied in. And so I specifically speak on that because most things, if not all things, really tied in with wealth and the wealth gap. Money is power. And if money is mostly retained by those that are white or a white adjacent in some fashion, then that's going to be 100% how we need to also be thoughtful about how we can fix ongoing power moves and moves that are going to inherently contribute to systemic racism. And so I mention this because one of the things that I see with two very young kids is that moving to better neighborhoods exposes me and my family to more and more racism and more pain and more gaslighting of our experiences, because we don't have other people who have experienced it along with us, and therefore it's our problem. It's an earned issue. It start by, in my opinion, is always start by recognizing how few interactions you have with people of color, how few interactions you have opening up your daily life to neighbors with color, how welcoming you are, because I'm saying that even from the perspective that when I moved to the neighborhood I very quickly realized that my children playing outside basically frightened the other children that were playing outside. So my children just stopped playing outside. And then I started protecting them from playing outside, because once other kids grouped together and my child would join, they'd be intentionally excluded or bullied out of the group, being told that they didn't know the rules or they didn't understand the game well. And so it happens within children. And I believe the science is that as young as 4, children recognize race and then apply the rules of race that they see at home to interact with others. So they will start interacting with people that their family members interact with intentionally. And if they see if it's very exclusive, they're going to do the same thing in school. So I've had a lot of experiences where my children were excluded. My children were verbally told things about, like even myself, and you guys maybe have even experienced as panelists, but food, like if you, as kids, if you brought food that was cultural into school, and you were amongst white American children, there was a lot of teasing and bullying. And so you start to even fear being able to express yourself outwardly. So there has to be, like Safir and Lisa had spoken about, really revering cultural differences, but also recognizing that there is an intentional like squelching of self-care, self-love, because it's self-protective, and it develops into when you become an adult and you're afraid of using your ethnic name at work because you know that may hinder you from my own father-in-law, who chooses to use Joey instead of his real name Jose, until he got into a high enough position and he specifically said, now I'm in a position of power and they're going to call me by my real name, but it took me years to get here. And I said, you know what? You probably, if other people don't experience or know or understand all these small pieces of the things that make us who we are, but they're so important to really understand, because a lot of it is just about, like you were saying, Safir, about loving and revering culturally, but also making sure that as a person who's maybe not experienced those cultures, to take those steps and intentionally go outward and not always stigmatize it because it's a bad neighborhood, because probably they're a bad neighborhood because they're not making money because of all these things we talked about. And so by engaging and participating and in creating a more positive outlook, you're actually really working to undo certain activities. And so, you know, I'm seeing this from the light of like my children. I'm even going, my family and I have looked at moving because of how painful our experiences are here. But that means for us losing a lot simply so that we can protect ourselves emotionally and not engage in what becomes harmful mental health and eventually self-defeating behavior, because we don't know how else to survive in this situation. And so I think anybody who's listening, if they can take away the fact that it's not, you know, just being a kid and once teasing your friend for what they brought to school to eat. Maybe it turned into multiple differences about their hair, their texture, their skin, I had a girlfriend, I remember one time I was in a pool and I had used her white towel and I cleaned my skin off with a towel. And she's like, ew, your skin, I can see it on your towel. Are you dirty? And I said, no, it's just that when you clean your skin off with a towel, if you have some dry skin, it will come off. But she just hadn't seen people of color before do that. And so I still remember that, obviously. So it meant something to me, but it still does. And it turns into a whole bunch of other things. And so I appreciate the opportunities to participate as a voice for my experiences, because like Thea had, there aren't books that are demonstrating my dermatological differences. Maybe, I think we said now they're actually inclusive of that to do more of a.
They're not there yet, but they're getting there.
But at least that, that's inclusion is moving us further away from what we have, which is exclusion. And what we had talked, obviously, and everybody understands this, so it's silly that we have to even have that conversation, but different does not, separate is not equal. And we need to really think about that. So I guess that's where my final thoughts were.
I think for me, the unlearning that, even though, like I said in my heart, I'm not a racist, this whole concept of the white stuff is better. And, back from busing Black kids into white neighborhoods to go to school, and it was like, well, why not just make the schools in the Black neighborhoods better, or do what it took to, and getting that whole,
that's a whole other series.
It is.
Because the other question is, why were the neighborhoods so segregated in the first place? Right.
Yeah.
And to the point of quote unquote bad neighborhoods. Okay, so it may be income based, but I've always said, people say, oh, well, that's a ghetto. Well, guess what makes a ghetto? Lack of services makes a ghetto. And I'm born and raised in Philadelphia, and I can tell you what neighborhoods will get plowed in the winter. I can tell you what neighborhoods didn't, and I don't know if you guys know, because of COVID, Philadelphia has had some trash collection issues because a lot of the trash collectors either were out because of COVID, or out because of childcare, or out because another family member had COVID, and trash started being a challenge. I can tell you what neighborhoods didn't have trash challenges.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, services or lack thereof can make these issues even, and they can also speak to health issues in terms of, the lack of services and the lack of street sweeping and street cleaning in cities. In rural areas, it's a difference with transportation or internet access. I'm joking, but I'm serious. That's a whole other workshop in terms of how many levels racism affects when it comes to how this country operates.
Yeah, and that's yeah, that yeah.
And even the definition of racist, and Lisa, I don't want you to take this personally necessarily, but in this country, because of how this country was founded, there's a level of racism or racistness, if that's a word, in everything we do. Someone talked, and I don't want to necessarily make this political, but there was someone at one of the conventions that made the statement that there aren't any laws based on race. Oh. And the Twitter post that I saw said, I think that's wrong, but I'm only 3/5 sure.
Yes. And not to
okay, and if you don't get the joke, it's because it was, there was this compromise that and it was only Black men who were counted as 3/5, in the Constitution of this country. And for someone to say that there are no laws based on race, it's like, come on.
Yeah.
What we have to do first is be truthful about the things that are factual. We can't even agree on that, and it's shown in, no pun intended, black and white, right? So, and then we have disability and race and society, socioeconomic, SES, and the rural and suburban and urban. Hopeful, yes, but pragmatic.
Mhm.
I mean, on a day-to-day basis, everyday strategies are what comes into play, at least for my family, putting one foot in front of the other, making sure there's food on the table, making sure there's an income, making sure that the car keeps running, you know, making sure that there's some fun, there's some joy, you know, there's health. And those are things that sometimes even we take for granted. You know, it's
We could go on
4:30, it's
forever.
4:30 over, and we could go on and on and on. But if there are next steps to take, it's to be introspective, you know, to check our own, you know, implicit biases, internal biases, and then look and see what that equity looks like in whatever situation you happen to be. It should reflect, maybe not your neighborhood, because your neighborhood may not reflect America, but it should at some level reflect the different cultures that have come to this country.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. And I think we need to move past, I think it's been a summer, that's for sure. I think
Yeah.
we need to move past that, sharing traumatic videos and things like that. That's not activism. You know, there's trauma porn, there's inspiration porn, there's, you know, all kinds of stuff that, you know, people talk about, and then they defend it with well, I'm creating awareness. And I think, sure, I guess there are some people who still need to be aware, but I don't think lack of awareness is necessarily the issue. It's maybe they're refused to accept the awareness that's out there already. So yeah, yeah, it's a lot of layers. Okay, if anybody want to have any other final thoughts, if not, we will close it out.
Oh, I wanted to say one thing. I swore I would say this. I had been thinking about it like before we even joined this panel. I always wanted to be able to tell all specialists and people who work with children to remember that you have an opportunity when you engage with children to model the interactions of two adults that are different for children that are younger, and encourage that loving attitude. So if you see a child and you're at a playground and your child is playing with just one collective group of kids, it should be your responsibility to try and explain, oh, do you see there's a pretty little girl over there and she doesn't look like she has any friends. Why don't you engage? And I'm talking about this as a person who's part of the community with children with disabilities, that I would hope that for my child, because they had a disability, people were doing that. But differences, and they should be things that you encourage your children to not be afraid of, but to include in their lives in a very courageous. And I would hope that they didn't think they were being courageous. It was just normal, but active way, engage with different types of people. But in doing that and asking your child to do that, you should be doing that yourself too. Be okay with talking to the person who looks different from you when you're at an appointment and COVID's over and you don't have to wear a mask and it's not weird. But at as many opportunities as you can, and that you don't do it in a patronizing way. I don't need you to tell me how nice my skin is or my hair is. I just need you to engage me as a normal person. And I hope that you encourage your children to do the same things, and that you encourage your students to do the same things. So that's all I really wanted to say.
I do have something briefly, Lisa. Thank you so much for that, Jess. Always very poignant points. And thank you to all of you, Sabra, Cheryl, Thea, and of course to you, Lisa, for the platform that you have lent to allow these discussions to take place. As I close, I think it's going to be important to state that it is critical that we begin to recognize the harmful effects that inequity, inequality, and injustice in our schools, and really take steps to correct them. We've got to correct our course of actions. Quality education is a vital part of a thriving community. Inclusion is a system that affords all students access and opportunity to thorough and efficient education is one that really adheres to the Constitution of this country. Any continued division within our schools, any lack of recognition thereof, it really can result in a system of apartheid. And really that would disproportionately harm and disenfranchise Black students. You know, these discussions that we've hosted, they were filled with data, they were filled with experiences, they were filled with perspectives, but they're filled with opportunities. And so for the larger audience that has joined us, I'm grateful that you have at least taken the opportunity to listen. And I hope that you can internalize what you have heard, begin to eliminate the theories that are so widely spread that somehow there is truth to the idea that supremacy of one group exists over the inferiority of another group. So that's really all that I have to say. We can really mitigate some of the problems that exist if we come together, acknowledge, and really address the issues in a unified fashion. I mean, the closer you are to the problem, the closer you are to the power. And we have the power now to make a difference.
Okay, that was a great ending note. So thank you, Saphir, and we will sign off.